Nummer 1, number 1, top right, second year, zweite Jahrgang. We'll explain why it's the second year in a second, because you would think, number 1, year 1. And then the subtitle, Zeitschrift für die Interessen der Arbeiterinnen, the magazine for the interests of female workers, edited by Emma Ihrer in Weltenmark. Formerly, she was kind of the producer of the newspaper, but it was the editorial work was done not in Welt and Mark, but in Stuttgart by a woman you're probably familiar with by the name of Clara Zetkin. Brackets Eisner was her original name before she got married. And it says here it appears every 2 weeks. It was what the Germans called a half monthly, a bi-monthly. 10 Pfennig an edition, which considering the costs of other items of living, etc., back then is actually extremely cheap. But we'll look at some of the finances, etc., behind it in a second. And yes, this was the year, as you can see, Monday, the 11th of January, 1892. Why is it not moving forward? There we go. Now it's back to click. So some background information about the publication, Equality, the magazine for the interests of female workers. It did have 2 forerunners, so this explains the second year or the year 2 phenomenon that we just saw with the first edition, because a year before this there was a magazine. It was a weekly magazine edited by Emma Ihrer called Die Arbeiterin, the female worker, but it ran into a lot of problems financially and was wound up. But this magazine, Die Gleichheit, was set up very much consciously as the successor of that, which is why you have, the first year was Die Arbeiterin, the second year then was Die Gleichheit, and before that Die Staatsbürgerin, the female citizen, but that was banned by censors in 1886. As you probably recall, the German anti-socialist laws were enforced from 1878 to 1890, and it was very tricky to set up any kind of public activity, and the female citizen fell short to that. So it's been something that distinctly, openly Marxist magazine aimed at women and female workers was something that the German socialist movement had attempted on a number of occasions, but really with Die Gleichheit, we see for a number of reasons the first real success in that field, and there are a number of factors behind it. You may have heard of Johann Heinrich Dietz, a wealthy publisher. He was influential in stepping in, following the problems with Die Arbeiterin, running the magazine, and providing funds to set up the new publication. It's a little bit disputed in the research as to why exactly he didn't want Emma Ihrer, the former editor, to be the main person behind it, behind the new magazine. And there's discussions about why exactly Zetkin was chosen, but there are a number of factors that worked out in Zetkin's favor. The new publication was to be based in Stuttgart, in one of the more liberal, if you liberal very much in inverted commas, states in the Kaiserreich Germany at the time, where, for example, Karl Kautsky was based. Karl Kautsky was a foreigner and couldn't actually be active politically in many German states, but he could be in Baden in Württemberg, in Stuttgart. And that's why the publishing, all the editorial stuff and basis was in that state. And Zetkin had just come back from a long period of exile in France and decided to move to Stuttgart with her 2 boys. So that, again, that lent itself to her being the editor as well. She knew Dietz from various jobs, translation works, articles she'd written, and obviously was very close with Kautsky as well, who was running Die Neue Zeit out of the weekly theoretical magazine out of Stuttgart. So kind of all these things came together, and Zetkin was chosen as the editor. She was initially quite reluctant because she felt that she didn't have the technical know-how to do it, etc., and she really didn't have any experience with publications apart from submitting articles to Die Neue Zeit, etc., from France. But they kind of spoke it through with her, and they said, "Come on, we can definitely do this." And yes, indeed, in 1892, that was the first edition. It comes again against the backdrop of the party entering into the legality again, following the fall of the anti-socialist laws. The Erfurt program, explicitly a Marxist program, agreed upon in Erfurt in 1891, in the autumn of 1891, with an explicit call for the emancipation of all without distinction of sex, etc. So that was very much the idea was that, okay, the party is now legal. We're starting to establish our printing press again, our propaganda and our agitational work, and so we really need a women's magazine. Die Gleichheit has been seen as Dietz's problem child in the sense that it didn't make any money. It wasn't in positive figures until I think about 1904. We'll look at that in a second. But it was very much close to his heart, and he really enjoyed working with Zetkin. And the other thing, while numbers, we'll look at the circulation figures in a bit, but while numbers were quite low at first, you also have to take into consideration that at the time, it was with organizing women was sometimes quite difficult, again, because there are laws. While social democracy is now legal, it's actually in many states, not in Stuttgart, but in many states, it's actually illegal for women to join political organizations at all. So sometimes it would be the case of the magazine kind of being passed around through several hands, etc. So it's sometimes tricky to pin down the official circulation figures, even though each party congress would produce these figures and budgets, etc., for the publication. You see on the picture here, Der Wahre Jakob was Dietz's, I suppose you'd call it meme publication, a satirical magazine that was enormously successful, made a lot of money, and incredibly wide audience, widely read, etc. And that essentially provided a lot of the excess funds to allow for publications like Die Neue Zeit, Kautsky's Die Neue Zeit, and Zetkin's Die Gleichheit to bring in bad numbers for a few years at the start before they started to grow. In 1901, the magazine became official party property. The Vorwärts publishing house, which I think consisted of 3 administrators or 3 heads, and it was Babel, Zinger, and someone else. And basically, in 1901, it becomes official party property under the Vorwärts publishing house, along with the Neue Zeit. And just quickly on the title of this, is kind of a German women's magazine of this talk. In 1907, it becomes the official publication of the international women's movement. So it's probably best to describe it, I suppose, as a German language women's publication, I suppose, because it did, as we'll see, have such an enormous influence internationally at the time within the German movement, within the Second International more broadly, particularly in places such as Russia, where it was widely read. I suppose what I think is important about this magazine, and indeed in a narrower sense about my project, is that the magazine is not merely a reflection of some of the most important twists and turns and developments within the women's movement, the social democratic women's movement, within social democracy as a whole, within the party, and within the nation, and indeed within the world, kind of moving outwards, but also it's one of the, as some of you may know, it's one of the perhaps most important publications and mouthpieces of the left and radical wing. I put it in inverted commas because it's slightly complicated, but the radical wing of international social democracy under the influences of Zetkin. So it's not just kind of holding a mirror up to these events and what's happening in these tumultuous times between 1892 and 1917, but is also through Zetkin's influence an attempt to shift discussion in the party and beyond. It also shouldn't really be seen as a women's publication in the traditional sense, is maybe the wrong way of putting it, but in the kind of widely underspread sense of the term. Die Gleichheit is about equality, not just between men and women, but for society as a whole. And as soon as you then raise the question of what is a women's publication, what are women's issues, etc., then we get into the question that really surrounds or shrouds this this publication and its reception and controversy between Marxism and feminism, etc. About what was the nature of this magazine. But for Zetkin, certainly the emphasis was on organizing. So it was an agitational and theoretical journal aimed at women, with the intention of drawing them into the workers' movement, into the party, and allowing them to become leading activists within that party, with women and men working alongside each other to overthrow capitalism. That was the guiding idea. So it wasn't just about, in that sense, solely so-called women's issues, but bringing, speaking to women and bringing them into the family, if you like, of social democracy. Did all sorts of things. One little example I quite like. It did kind of go into the details of, you know, the horrible situation of women workers at the time, the terrible wages they received, the sexism they experienced, the conditions, the huge strains on their time with family duties, etc., etc. And it would name names. So I have here in brackets Robert Bosch. Bosch, I don't know if you have today, for example, dishwashers or washing machines with Bosch on them. But Robert Bosch was the leading guy, actually from Stuttgart. He was a very close friend of Claudia Zetkin's, and he was known for treating his workers relatively well. But when he didn't, and then particularly with his female workers, she would have no qualms about naming him by his name in the magazine. It would also have an organizational focus, so it would look to, again, especially in the early period, in times of semi-legality, if you like, when it came to organizing women, there would be lists of meetings and people to contact and things going on across Germany. So that was a key thing of it. But I think fundamentally as well, if you look at what Zetkin's aims were with that magazine, it was very much in the mold of Kautsky's Die Gleichheit, with a focus on women and women workers. So Zetkin, you know, was once asked, you know, there were complaints, for example, about it being quite difficult to read, particularly, again, you look at the context of 1890s Germany. A lot of women couldn't read or had only just learned to read, for example, given the state of the school system, etc. But she was saying, no, this magazine is about, yes, describing the situation in capitalism, yes, organizing women in the movement, but also, and fundamentally, it's a question of theoretical education and enlightenment and training. And I think that in that sense, you know, it did kind of fashion itself to a certain extent, according to the successful or the main theoretical weekly in Germany at the time, which was Karl Kautsky's Die Gleichheit. Some figures you may or may not be aware of. Zetkin, obviously, we will talk about in a lot more detail. Karen Honeycutt, who wrote a PhD and I think published it as a book in the 70s, a biography of Zetkin, described Die Gleichheit as a one-woman show. We'll talk about that in a second. Käthe Duncker, who was together with her husband Hermann Duncker, they were kind of lifelong members of the radical wing of social democracy, later KPD. She wrote an untranslated book in 1914 called Socialist Education at Home. And as we will see, one of the main thematic focuses of Die Gleichheit was the question of socialist pedagogy and the raising of children, which is fascinating, and it's only something I'm just starting to scratch the surface of. Emma Ihre, we talked about her, a long-standing figure of the German women's movement and workers' movement. She was removed from the editorial board. I say her role, as you saw from the first slide, it was, you know, produced by Emma Ihre in Felten. She was removed eventually in 1901, following differences over questions of revisionism, etc., which we'll talk about in a bit. Maria Juhacz, who is pictured there on the top right of your screens. she was a majority SPD activist, so came out of the SPD, the kind of pro-war wing of it, who replaced Clara Zetkin as editor in 1917 and developed what's in the literature is known as the New Gleichheit. We'll talk briefly about that, the fate of that magazine. Heinrich Schulz, an incredibly important figure, kind of like the nemesis of Zetkin in a way, somebody who worked closely with her again on the question of SPD's education, pedagogy, approach to school, not just to education at home, but also the school system, etc. And at a very famous Mannheim, was it Mannheim? Very famous Congress in 1908, he and Clara Zetkin both gave long speeches introducing the kind of guidelines for educational policy of the SPD. He later became a social chauvinist and the state secretary for education in the early Weimar Republic, and was responsible for the school bill there. We'll return to that question later on, but he's a significant figure. He also wrote a lot for Die Gleichheit. So again, it wasn't just aimed at women. It was also, it wasn't just women writers, also men wrote for it. Luxembourg, who again generally dismissed as somebody not interested in the women's question, broadly speaking, but she wrote on a number of occasions throughout the history of Die Gleichheit when Zetkin was the editor, very close with Zetkin. And what's interesting about the relationship with Luxembourg and Zetkin, for example, is that if you look at J.P. Nettle's book on Luxembourg, he makes 2 points about Zetkin, kind of snide points. One is that she was so-called intellectually lesser than Luxembourg, perhaps. But, you know, and then he says about Zetkin, she concerned herself with women's issues, right? And that was her legacy. And you know, looking at some of the stuff, the recent upturn in interest in Zetkin, for example, both of those statements are certainly can be questioned. But anyway, before we go on, let's have a brief look at the figures. We're not going to go into the huge details of it, but you can see the gradual growth from the first figures we have it from 1902. And again, it should be stressed that these are taken, you know, with all the warts and all, as it were, in terms of accounting for how many were sold and distributed. But it was kind of a ritual, a yearly annual ritual at the SPD congresses, that not only would you get the full financial report for the party as a whole, but you would get the circulation figures for all of the Vorwärts, the party publications published under the Vorwärts publishing house, which I mentioned before, Die Neue Zeit, Die Gleichheit, and Der wahre Jakob. And that would be a kind of standard thing, and then there would be questions about the situation, etc. The dates that are worth looking out for, say 1904 is the first time that publication is in the black, so it's actually starting to make some money. 1905, there's a double, it kind of doubles there between 1904, 1905, 1905, 1906 doubles again. And that's a significant year in the history of the publication, as we'll see, because we have the introduction of the two supplements into the magazine, which changes or modifies somewhat the nature of the magazine, I would argue. And then, you know, broadly speaking, there's pretty constant growth. There's a bit of a wobble towards the end of the 1900s, and you can see as the party continues to grow, so does the Die Gleichheit, and that would obviously, these circulation figures would also entail what was called mandatory subscriptions, I suppose, so from various party organizations, union organizations, etc. But those were the figures that they worked with. What's interesting as well, if you taking a step back from the standpoint of SPD politics more generally, is that in 1914 these annual reports stopped completely. So it seems to be part of kind of a precondition of the Burgfrieden, the fortress peace that the party concludes with the German government, the war government, that these reports stop. And the other thing worth noting about 1914 is that precisely because Zetkin uses Die Gleichheit as a a factional magazine, indeed always had done, in 1914 she really steps up the struggle against the pro-war policies of the majority of the SPD and the leadership at the time, and there's an active boycott of the publication in 1914. I don't know where the figures come from, but basically the stuff I've read is that this subscription cancellation campaign by the party leadership sees the circulation fall by about half within a year or two. So that's worth noting as well in terms of the fate of Die Gleichheit over the years. We talked about the one-woman show. Basically, certainly in the early days, Zetkin would write pretty much everything, and that reflected the early days of the magazine. But as it grows and the editorial apparatus solidifies, it draws in more and more people, and there's obviously people sending reports not just from other parts of Germany but internationally, as we'll see. And I'm starting to, one of the things I'm doing for my project is I'm starting to categorize in one big database each edition. So all of the contents of each edition, scanning each edition for future archives, more accessible archives for translation, etc. And it's always worth having a quick look. Each edition will have the editorial. You have the little title, and you can see all of the issues that Zetkin is really trying to push at that time. And they're usually, say, relatively high level theoretically, which causes some controversy, but always really good reads. And you can see it, as I say, you can follow the developments, the more broader developments at the time, by looking at Zetkin's editorials and what she's trying to raise. She was criticized for never signing the editorials, but she defended that, saying, well, what's the problem? The other issue, of course, is that some article, when it comes to signing articles, is that if somebody's based in Prussia, for example, that could be potentially at least cause for arrest. So that was the other thing with signing articles. But some articles were indeed signed. There were some pseudonyms, but some would sign with their own name. Zetkin tended not to do that as the editor. In terms of the politics of the publication, one of the things that the Die Gleichheit, particularly in the early days, was known for was kind of biting polemics with the broader Frauenrechtlerinnen, or the Frauenrechtlerei, as she calls it, so the kind of women's rightists, the bourgeois women's movement of the time. And it's interesting because Zetkin herself had an interesting background. Her father was a kind of Lutheran teacher, which partly accounts for a lifelong interest in pedagogy and teaching. She trained as a teacher as well, and she was taught by an incredibly influential member of the bourgeois women's movement, so she was very influenced by her teacher August Schmidt. But as a youngster, then she started to break with a lot of the teachings of Schmidt and others, much to the concern of Schmidt and her mother. Her mother was also a significant member of the bourgeois women's movement. Was Clara Zetkin love Maria Juchacz? We talked about her earlier on, the replacement of Zetkin in 1917. The centrality of Zetkin to Die Gleichheit has also found reflection in the controversy, I suppose, that surrounds the magazine. It's not that lots and lots of stuff is written about it, but the fact that Zetkin was so insistent on this line of kind of marching together with the bourgeois women's movement when it demanded the organizational separation, theoretical clarity, no concessions, etc., no concessions to the revisionists, etc., that she came in for a lot of flack, not just from the right, but often, obviously, from the right, described as dogmatic, dictatorial in their editorial ways, and depending on who you read, you get a range of opinions on her. Of course, was Clara Zetkin loved? Was what Maria Juchacz asked in a 1950s kind of life sketch of her, which was, for all its criticisms, was quite sympathetic to Zetkin in its own ways. But as I say, you cannot remove, Zetkin is so central to Die Gleichheit that she can't really, the fate of that magazine cannot be removed or separated from her own fate. And as I've written before on Zetkin, very few figures in the German women's movement, for example, are treated so differently as Zetkin. So your dogmatic anti-feminist communist, feminist without borders, red feminist, you know, the most dangerous witch of the Kaiserreich, I think Kaiser Wilhelm once called her. So, you know, she's many things to many people. Mehring, I think, speaks for the, you know, the majority of what we would call revolutionary social democracy when he says that the volumes of Die Gleichheit are an eternal monument to Clara Zetkin. Throughout its history, the publication stood on the heights of the principle of socialism, with few people alive today being able to compete with Zetkin's knowledge of Marxist theory. So again, you go back to J.P. Nettles, you know, understanding of Zetkin kind of just being this second-rate thinker who just went and did, you know, women's things or whatever, very dismissive of her that he was. And I think partly because Die Gleichheit has received such little scholarly attention or political attention, particularly in English, you know, we don't realize just how influential, how important Zetkin was and remains today. Okay, significant dates, evolution of the publication. I'm slightly conscious of time, so we'll move through a little bit quicker. 1904, new child protection law in the Reich. That might seem secondary, but it's significant because as a result of this, the social democratic women's movement decides to use Die Gleichheit as a way of coordinating political work amongst children. So Zetkin describes this law as a social reformist dog's dinner, and the social democratic women's movement agreed to establish commissions for the protection of children. Now that gives it a rather kind of narrow approach, but basically some of the works that would involve would be, you know, going out, organizing kids on the weekends or afternoons with no school, taking them out into nature, organizing sports events, trying to bring in particularly their mothers, but, you know, families generally, particularly their mothers, into the social democratic women's movement, you know, in order to save, as I think Zetkin puts it, you know, save large numbers of children from physical decay as well as intellectual and moral barbarization. And yeah, these commissions would go and work with families and help them out. And it took on, it sounds like a kind of niche thing, but it took on huge proportions. And, you know, you get stories of, you know, 50,000 school kids being organized in a summer camp in Frankfurt, them organizing all sorts of games and events, and chocolate being supplied by the local consumer cooperative, treats for the kids, etc. You know, really kind of interesting stuff that, you know, as somebody who's been looking at social democracy now for probably nigh on 20 years, things that just were not, that I was not particularly aware of. And so that was a conscious decision by the party, by Zetkin and others, and by the Social Democratic Women's Movement to really step up the work there. And in 1905, we see that two supplements to the Die Gleichheit, so the main bi-weekly theoretical it would have within its pages, For Our Mothers and Housewives. Okay, from today's perspective, the title doesn't seem particularly well chosen, but we'll go with that for now. And For Our Children. And really, as far as I can tell, certainly when it comes to children, these are the first and certainly one of the few such supplements in the history of the movement, and you know, huge enduring interest. I know the British workers' movement does things with kind of socialist Sunday schools, etc., but I don't think it was really on this scale. And the supplements we'll have a brief look at them in a second, but you know, fascinating. I'm just starting to, as I say, starting to get to grips with them. 1914 is obviously a significant date for a number of reasons, but the production of the paper becomes incredibly difficult, shortages, and then of course censorship. And as I've alluded to before, Zetkin uses the magazine as a rallying cry, really, of the left internationally, bringing together the Bern Conference of Social Democratic Women, for example, in 1915, using very much Die Gleichheit as kind of the launch pad for that. I should have said this, by the way, as well. No, I did say that about how it was the international, the publication of the International Women's Movement at the time, Social Democratic Women's Movement. And then, yeah, all the struggles with the census that she had, which we'd have to change every sentence, but then eventually just left the marks of the censor in for the reader to guess what was being excised. removed as editor, but replaced by Juhacz and Heinrich Schulz, both of whom we've just briefly discussed. But her involvement in the USPD provides the immediate pretext for that move, and she's turned out pretty much overnight. The New Gleichheit, different focus and shift towards more individual and liberation and empowerment of women, which is interesting. This is working from a PhD dissertation by Miriam Sachse, which is in German, but very much worthwhile reading for those of you who can read German. And she makes the point that there's this huge shift. Obviously, my project is looking up until the point where Zetkin is removed, so more of a focus on that. But Sachse is very good at comparing and contrasting the two. And she says that while terms like class struggle and socialism still feature, they do so far less. And in 1923, the publication is wound up again, so the specter of financial problems with these publications, but obviously in Germany in 23 things are terrible, and I think is Sachse points out that one issue costs around 40,000 marks at one point, which is just incredible, from 10 Pfennig for the publication. I've got The Sorrows of Young Werther, picture by famous work by Goethe. You'll hopefully see why in a second. Central themes and features of the magazine. So I'm talking here up until 1917. They vary and shift across the years, but the main things are the editorials. We talked about those already. Often controversies within the party. So Zetkin would use often in the run-up to a party congress, and subsequently use it as a way of trying to impose her agenda and the agenda of her comrades against the revisionists, for example, in these pages, and making it clear to women how important it was for them to stand for election for these congresses, to put motions forward, etc. So that's been useful to look at. And then themes: militarism, colonialism, the right to vote, and ladies' suffrage, which is what how she dismissed the bourgeois women's movement that wanted the vote for women, but only certain women. Revision and reformism. The women's workers' movement, I alluded to this earlier on, but this was a regular feature of a networking feature of the paper, particularly useful before 1908, when it was basically illegal for women to join political organizations in most states. And you would also then, get detailed information, quite useful for historians as well, to look back. Oh, in October there was this congress, in this date there was this international congress, and obviously you would also have detailed reports of the women's international congresses, which began in the early 1900s. News in brief. So again, just a selection, again, usually Zetkin selecting various things from around the world that would shed light on what's going on in the social democratic women's movement or in social democracy. So something would happen in America with the struggle for women's suffrage, whatever there, and and this is why, you see, we need an independent women's movement that's based on the workers' movement, etc. Things like that, but also kind of weird things on new inventions that were happening around the world that she would then comment on, etc. So quite interesting. Historical pieces, very strong, as I said before, very strong historical theoretical focus, which is significant, I think. Zetkin, but Dunker and some others wrote lead articles, usually serialized as well. So one of the most famous pieces, early pieces by Zetkin, is a series on female communards, which was eventually developed into a brochure, but I think was maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7 pieces in a series in Die Gleichheit. Advertising, worth mentioning, we talked about funds on a number of occasions, but Zetkin would allow, I think it was 20 Pfennig per line. She would allow public advertising from the workers' movement. So she would say, look, if it's important meetings, publications, etc., we'll advertise it, but we won't go to businesses. We won't go to, the kind of capitalist world in that sense. That was the main focus of it, and again, relatively cheap. But as Sachse points out, in 1917, the New Gleichheit changes considerably. So you've got all sorts of weird and wonderful things being advertised to women in 1917, diet pills, wigs, fashion, etc. And Sachse points out that, actually, what's revealing about this is that a lot of these items were very much beyond the reach of the average woman worker at the time. And she argues that maybe Die Gleichheit at this point has become more a publication of the so-called New Woman. I won't go into that in Weimar Germany, but also very much the publication of the wives or of political functionaries in the early Weimar government, or the functionaries themselves for that matter. Cultural pieces, this brings us back to Goethe and Werther. Poems, novellas, short stories, often serialized. So again, you'd have to pick up the next edition to find out what was going on. The first such short story was by none other than Nina Kautsky, Kautsky's playwright and actor mother, which again was spread out. I think it was called Christmas. It was spread out about six different editions of Die Gleichheit. Obviously probably on Kautsky's suggestion, I've got this lying around, would you like to use that? And that, but what some people have pointed out here is a criticism of Zetkin. There would be a lot of people like Goethe, Schiller, Shakespeare, etc., which for some writers, well, it's problematic because A, they're men, was mainly men, and B, they're mainly from the kind of pantheon of bourgeois high culture, and that's a source of criticism of Zetkin, including by some of her friends, but such as Rosa Luxemburg. But maybe we won't go into that now. There is in the top right is that's actually not a proper edition of it, but that's the For Our Children supplement. That will be, there was such demand for these things that every year they would produce an annual of all the supplements from that year in a red book with gold lettering, but that is actually a GDR edition. It's not an original one, but it would look something like that, I assume. And so, yeah, these supplements looking at, for our housewives, for our mothers, for our children, you can see why in many ways they're ahead of their time. The demands they were making on education, for secular education, for nationally based education, etc., far ahead of the time, perhaps in some ways, in terms of you look at this description of Zetkin's of the new magazine. She says that now with these supplements, it would not only be a faithful advisor to the woman seeking to take part in a classist struggle for liberation, i.e. the very founding idea of Die Gleichheit that I outlined, but also assist in her, quote, all-rounded development and the better fulfillment of her duties as a housewife and mother. And for our mothers and housewives would indeed have things like tips for the household, advice on how to stay healthy, look after the sick. It would contain fashion advice of sorts, although not linked to capitalist enterprises. And the most popular column, which was mainly written by Schultz and Dunker, was called The Mother as Educator of Her Children. Again, lots of interesting materials there. Here is, again, time is running short, but we can have a brief look at these. So again, just to take a step back from this, you see the language of the supplements is quite different, is markedly different, in fact, from the Zetkin editorials about, the nature of colonialism in modern capitalism, or the significance of Bernstein in the development of Marxist theory, whatever. These were very much more of an agitational nature, I suppose. And in that sense, I think do have to be seen as a concession of that Zetkin makes to some of her critics that would say, look, we go to some of these women and they say, yeah, we're happy to support, we like your cause, but I can't understand a word of Die Gleichheit, right? And again, for some reason, for good reasons in some sense, as I say, given the state of education, etc., in the Kaiserreich of the time. But yeah, different approach, different emphasis, I suppose, but you've got to remember it was a supplement, so it was still part of that kind of broader package that I've outlined about, schooling radical women, radicalizing women in Marxist political theory. So here's some advice to look after your kids. This is free for those of you who've got kids, or how you should have looked after your kids maybe, but keep your word, be friendly to your children, become their friend, control yourself, be prepared to help. Use your time wisely. Decorate your house. Look for the beautiful in things. Don't be a chatterbox. Avoid alcohol, and don't raise little hurrah patriots. Very relevant, of course, given Britain in the past few weeks. Maybe one more we got time for. Honor the pioneers of our struggle. Don't put up with any showing off. Insist on good manners. Don't give long sermons. Maybe one piece of advice I should have taken. You shouldn't mollycoddle your kids. Go on walks with them. Familiarize your children with overcoming obstacles. Tell your kids the truth about sexual matters. raise your children to be independent thinkers, speak to your children. So very kind of micro flavor impression of what these some of these supplements would contain. And I've talked about the kind of contrast with the rest of the paper here. But Zetkin, for example, described them as not speaking their language that is above the hearts and minds of the proletarian readers, but that captures them in their daily hardship, needs and desires, and simultaneously raises them above their dull day-to-day existence. They are, as it were, a piece of pedagogical visual instruction written in undemanding and unpretentious language that is appropriate to the readership to which they are mainly addressed. And it has to be said that the children's supplements, which we haven't got time to go in for today, that may be for a future discussion, they were so popular that party congresses actually saw many motions demanding that the 95 other party newspapers would include such supplements, because they were really popular with kids, and have largely been forgotten, with one exception which we'll look at the end in terms of the GDR, very significant to the GDR, these pedagogical materials for kids. But yeah, I've talked about the Christmas annual of the Our Children for Our Children supplement. This is Heinrich Schulz. So again, I talked about how he worked with Zetkin closely on questions of socialist pedagogy. Initially, he was always kind of more sympathetic to the right, I suppose, but they were able to work together and did some good work. So in 1904, they say that freeing primary schools from the unworthy position they occupy today as the handmaid of the ruling classes in the church can only be the working class by means of the class struggle. So very much relevant, ahead of its time, pioneering, whatever you'd like to say. But there was a theoretical difference, a theoretical clash between them, even in the early days, so long before the kind of support for the war, etc. And Schulz was of the view that kind of an explicitly socialist education was neither possible nor desirable within capitalist society, because politics and struggle would, as he put it, disrupt the golden naivety and unspoiled years of youth. So this idea, I suppose, which is still prevalent, still has some purchase, and still perhaps common sense in some ways, that the best years of one's life should be kind of spent in this in more of a bubble, I suppose, of exploration and kind of a detachment from the world. And Zetkin, I'm not quite sure exactly where I stand in this discussion, but Zetkin was clear that there are a number of false presuppositions here, and what this required, what she thought was required, was breaking with these kind of misunderstood concepts of freedom, spontaneity, according to which parents shouldn't impinge too much or impose too much on their kids. But on the other hand, she said that it shouldn't be a question of kind of tendentious political slogans being rote learnt and then parroted by the kids either. So interesting discussion. Again, I don't think has been mentioned or commented on, certainly for a long time. But she does say that socialist parents and mothers in particular, so she's appealing to mothers in this speech, she says, if you do your bit in this regard, i.e. raising kids as socialists, and you become active for the socialist education of our children in a useful fashion, you will help our socialist trained mothers raising their children to become class fighters. So this is an appeal to the party as well, for the importance of pedagogical work. They will then become soldiers, not of the reaction, but of revolution, freedom, and cultural progress. I spoke earlier briefly about Schulz and how he became State Secretary for Education. He developed in 1921 the National Education Bill. And what's interesting about that, Zetkin was a member of parliament at the time in the Reichstag, and she absolutely hammers him for this, because she argues that, well, quite correctly, that 2 or 3 of the main pillars of socialist pedagogy, the ideas, the guidelines that they had outlined, particularly on secularism and a nationally coordinated education program. Remember, Germany is very federal to this day. That both of those pledges were broken and reneged upon by the SPD, and she locates it in the kind of alliance in the so-called Weimar coalition between the Liberals, the SPD, and the Catholic Centre. And she argues that the SPD is essentially backpedaled on secular education, made secular education something that parents themselves had to apply for rather than the norm. So she said this is like, asking children to be educated in cages, basically, secular cages. traces that back to a deal with the Catholic Centre Party over votes to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. But interesting to see where these two people go, because again, it reflects social democracy more broadly. Another key thing, I might not spend too much time on this, it's just a long quote by Zetkin at a conference about the significance of the youth in the SPD, so not just education in the family and in schools, but the active organization of young socialists in particular. And 1908 is a significant date here as well, because it's a time in which a new law is passed that forbids young people, I think under 16, but it could be 18, I can't remember which one, forbids them from taking part in political activity. And we all heard of Karl Liebknecht, who was basically the leader of the young movement. He actually goes to jail for that pamphlet he wrote there, Militarism and Anti-Militarism, but I'm sure many of you would have read. It's in English. And here the subtitle is, with a particular focus on the international youth movement. So Zetkin kind of takes up the battle for Liebknecht and defends many of his ideas at SPD congresses, etc. And while many in the SPD Education Commission, which Zetkin also sat on, responded to this law by saying, well, we just need kind of educational associations for the youth. We need to draw them into the party school. Zetkin argued, look, we have experience not only of being banned as a party in the socialist laws, but also banned as women from taking part in political activity. We need to draw on that tradition, that revolutionary tradition, not give in to the dictates of the Kaiser state. Almost done. Controversy and criticism, and then reception. Sorry for dragging on slightly. We've talked about the role of Zetkin, dictatorial or dogmatic. So many of her opponents on the right would say, she was dictatorial, dogmatic. They would also mention, oh, look, nobody, especially in the early days in the revisionist controversy, look, nobody reads Die Gleichheit. It's meant to these women. None of them understand it. It's a waste of time. Blah, blah, blah. How dare you criticize our main publication for being for its politics when look at your own publication? And she makes the point, well, even if Die Gleichheit was the worst publication on the planet, I would still have the right and the duty, she says, to criticize reformism. Age-old questions of women's brackets party organization, autonomy and centralization, especially after 1908. So again, just very briefly, without dragging this on too long, after 1908, it's then legally across the Reich for women to join political organizations, which means that their role in the party becomes a more normal or standard or traditional one, whereas in the past, you would have women's propaganda commissions that had a little bit more autonomy in the way that they acted, because they needed to. They would have trusted representatives that they would turn to, etc. And that kind of question of how then these would be reintegrated, reabsorbed into the party was clearly a bone of contention. And I've even read feminists, writers on Zetkin saying, yeah, basically the party then just did the job of what the police used to do, which is obviously a huge exaggeration, but it's clearly was a cause for controversy. Zetkin is criticized also for, again, often under the freedom of criticism refrain, and we know where that comes from in terms of Lenin, Kautsky, the revisionist controversy, etc. But there were no letters. There wasn't a letters page. It was very difficult sometimes to see, how would people respond. But on the other hand, it should be said that Zetkin would publish articles critical of her, even those from the right. But often she would have the last word then in kind of fighting back. And what's interesting as well is that she even in 1914 printed statements from pro-war party organizations of women, which is interesting, and then respond, of course. Accessibility, we've talked about that, and the concession in 1905. The abundance of male writers, particularly in the cultural section, we've talked about that. The preponderance of bourgeois culture in its pages and the traditional understanding of a genius addressing a largely passive audience. I think Goethe, think Schiller, think Shakespeare. But for Zetkin was very much of the idea, and she was criticized by this for Luxembourg. Zetkin said that just as Engels thinks that the proletariat will be the heir of classical philosophy, so will the proletariat be the heir, the inheritor of classical art and culture, and the questions of art and culture and aesthetics were ones that were central to Zetkin throughout her life. Famously, she wrote the pamphlet Art and the Proletariat in 1910, I think 1911, which is still to be translated, but it did lead to a discussion, a friendly one, in 1908, when it came to the education of the youth between her and Luxemburg. Luxemburg arguing that basically it's not about taking something over, it's about creating something qualitatively new. But for Zetkin, clearly the emphasis was on, okay, if we want to make a good socialists, if we want to give these women a rounded view, that means starting with the greatest that the bourgeoisie has achieved. And I think in that sense of that kind of tragic, I think it's in John Reed, that tragic image of peasants being so cold in Russia that they're burning copies of Goethe and etc. So that's a debate that maybe is of interest, maybe not. But I would say this is that much of the reception of this kind of focus on bourgeois culture is that it's kind of tied up with this very complicated standard, if you like, reception of Western reception of the SPD as kind of radical in appearance, but bourgeois in essence. That's also worth bearing in mind. I've talked about the fact that very little has been written on Die Gleichheit, and I'm sure that I hope many of you here are hearing this stuff for the first time, and your ears are pricked, as it were. Anne gave a talk on Lisa Vogel, and I just went back. I haven't read that book for years, but I went back and just had a look at what she talks about in the Second International. And really, maybe comrades can correct me, but it's just a few pages on this. And given the centrality, the significance, the sheer output of this magazine. This is 25 years under Zetkin, fortnightly publication, 10 pages, tiny writing. It's clear that those such as Vogel, are overlooking something central because they dismiss this history as reformist, waste of time, etc. They're missing something central. In the Eastern Bloc, however, and again, I don't want to spend too much time on this, we kind of have an opposite picture, what I call detailed dogmatism. So actually Eastern scholarship is incredibly detailed and useful. So a lot of the stuff you'll read is detailed and interesting, and I've been flicking through it. Obviously, it's then always filtered back through the main kind of foundation myths of the GDR, etc. Particularly, we have to be slightly concerned when you see that they're using Zetkin as a kind of stamp of approval for a Marxist theory of education within the GDR. The party is always right, and as I said to somebody the other day, Zetkin's career essentially is what is living proof of the fact that the party is almost never right, so that's interesting. But the GDR scholarship, there is quite a lot written on that, and I would argue, and I won't make too much of a thing of this now, I would argue maybe some of the more conservative features or of their time features that I kind of alluded to are then taken and kind of solidified as the answer. So questions the abolition of the family. They quite rightly, GDR historians make the point that, well, Karl Marx and Engels in the Communist Manifesto, they're against they say we're not for the abolition of the family. But then there's a distinction in German between Abschaffung, like getting rid of something, and Aufhebung, which may know from your Hegel, which is something taking on higher social forms and kind of negating itself, but raising itself to a new and higher form, which the GDR scholars don't really countenance. We've also seen, for example, uncommented censorship and excision of critical comments that Zetkin made on the Russian Revolution, obviously. And I do think that in the GDR, she was held up as this person who, for those women who were struggling with like what's called the triple burden of work, family, and politics. I think there's a kind of cynical instrumentalization of Zetkin as saying, well, look, if she could do it, this incredibly rare, unique, brilliant person, as Luxemburg, I think, once said, when does Clara ever sleep? Then you can do it too. And there's obviously a cynical side to that. But I would just end again. Sorry for going on for so long. There's clearly a vacuum here. I'm really excited about going forward with this publication, taking a deeper dive into it, because it's clearly one of the most significant publications in two senses in our history. In two senses: one, as a mouthpiece of radical social democracy and Marxism, but also as a mouthpiece of radical social democracy and Marxism and the women's movement, which is clearly relevant and important today. But I will stop there. Thank you very much.